It is the morning of Thursday, October 24th, 1929. New York City is waking up the way it always does, with ambition, with noise, with an almost reckless sense of forward momentum. The sun cuts through the canyons of Lower Manhattan at a shallow angle, gilding the upper floors of the great towers while the streets below remain in cool shadow. Men in crisp suits pour from subway exits. Newsboys hawk papers on every corner. The headlines, as they have been for months, carry an almost evangelical tone. The market is up, the economy is strong, America is unstoppable. A broker named Harold Simmons steps from a cab on Broad Street, tips his hat to the doorman at his brokerage office, and remarks to no one in particular that today is going to be another fine day to be alive. His shoes are new. His watch is expensive. His confidence is absolute. Inside the exchange, the atmosphere is electric in the way it has been every morning for the past 2 years. The trading floor, that cavernous marble-columned hall that looks more like a cathedral than a marketplace, is filling with the noise of men preparing for the opening bell. Runners check their stations. Telephone operators settle into their chairs. Specialists arrange their order books. The ticker tape machine sits ready, its paper ribbon coiled like a spring. Everything is exactly as it should be. And then, something isn't. It's almost imperceptible at first. A broker near post 12 glances at an order sheet and furrows his brow. Across the room, a telephone begins to ring and rings longer than it should before anyone answers. A cluster of men near the western gallery speaks in lowered voices. One of them looks up, not at anything in particular, just up, the way a man does when something in his body knows something his mind hasn't caught up to yet. By the time the opening bell rings at 10 o'clock that morning, something catastrophic has already begun. They just don't know it yet. The screaming starts slowly. One voice, then 3, then dozens. The ticker tape begins to fall behind reality, printing prices that are already ancient history. Men who arrived this morning with everything are watching numbers collapse on a board that cannot keep up with how fast their world is ending. Outside, on Broad Street and Wall Street and the narrow lanes between, people begin to gather. Ordinary people, clerks and secretaries and curious passers-by, drawn by a sound they've never heard before rising from inside those marble walls. It is the sound of panic. And in that moment, the illusion shattered. To understand what happened in that building on that October morning, you need to go back, not just weeks or months, but to the roots of a belief system so powerful, so deeply embedded in the American psyche, that it had begun to feel less like economics and more like religion. The 1920s, the decade the newspapers called the Roaring Twenties, were a kind of miracle. After the horrors of the First World War, after the flu pandemic that had killed 50 million people across the globe, the world had decided it was done with suffering. The mood of the era was electric, defiant, almost giddy. In the United States especially, the post-war boom had created something that felt unprecedented, a genuine, sustained expansion of wealth that seemed to be reaching ordinary people for the very first time. Factories hummed. Radio stations broadcast into millions of homes. Automobiles rolled off assembly lines faster than anyone had thought possible. Department stores sold everything from refrigerators to silk stockings to curious new financial instruments that almost nobody fully understood. The economy wasn't just growing. It was accelerating. And at the center of it all, pulsing like a living heart, was Wall Street. The stock market in the mid-1920s was not what it had been a generation earlier, a realm of wealthy industrialists and private bankers conducting discreet transactions behind closed doors. Something had changed. Something fundamental. For the first time in American history, ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, teachers, factory workers, housewives, were participating in the market in meaningful numbers. The newspapers wrote about it with breathless excitement. Radio programs discussed stock tips alongside weather reports. Barbers gave investment advice alongside haircuts. Taxi drivers compared portfolios. The market, it seemed, was the great equalizer. The mechanism by which any American, regardless of background, regardless of education, could become rich. But what no one realized, or rather, what almost no one wanted to acknowledge, was that much of this wealth was not real. It was built on something far more fragile than prosperity. It was built on belief. And belief, as history has demonstrated with cruel regularity, can evaporate in an instant. Here is what was actually happening inside the machine that everyone was celebrating. During the 1920s, an enormous proportion of stock market investment was being conducted on what was called margin, a term that sounds technical and bloodless but concealed within it a mechanism of extraordinary danger. To buy on margin meant that an investor did not need to pay the full price of a stock. They needed only a fraction of it, sometimes as little as 10%. The rest was borrowed from their broker. Think about what that meant in practice. A man with $1,000 could control $10,000 worth of stock. If the stock went up 10%, he doubled his money. The math was intoxicating. The risk, the fact that if the stock went down 10% he'd have lost everything, the fact that he'd still owe the broker the full amount of the loan, was something most people simply chose not to think about. Because the market never went down. Not really. Not for long. Between 1924 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the primary measure of American stock market performance, nearly tripled in value. Tripled. In 5 years. Companies whose fundamentals had barely changed were selling at prices that bore no relationship to what they actually earned or owned. The market had entered a phase that economists, in the safety of retrospect, call a speculative bubble, but which, in the moment, felt to almost everyone involved like the natural, permanent state of things. John J. Raskob, one of the most prominent financial voices of the era, published an article in the Ladies' Home Journal in August 1929, just weeks before the crash, titled, "Everybody Ought to Be Rich." In it, he argued that any American who invested just $15 a month in the stock market would, within 20 years, have accumulated $80,000. He was not a fringe figure. He was a director of General Motors. The article was taken seriously. People read it and nodded and went to their brokers. This is where everything started to go wrong. Not because investment was bad. Not because ambition was foolish. But because a system had been built, quietly, incrementally, over years, that had no real floor. A system in which rising prices justified buying, which caused prices to rise further, which justified more buying, in a loop that could only continue as long as everyone agreed to keep playing. And the moment someone decided to stop, the moment a critical mass of people decided that they wanted their money back rather than more paper profits, the entire structure would begin to collapse under its own weight. What almost no one recognized in 1929 was that they were living inside that moment. The loop was already breaking. The summer of 1929 was, on its surface, magnificent. August saw the market hit its all-time high. The Dow Jones Industrial Average touched 381 points on September 3rd, a figure so elevated, so detached from economic reality, that it would not be reached again for another 25 years. The newspapers celebrated. The radio hosts celebrated. And in brokerage offices across the country, in homes in Ohio and Iowa and California where ordinary people checked their portfolios with trembling hope, there was a sensation that felt like standing at the very top of the world. But something had been shifting beneath the surface for months. In September, the market had begun to wobble. Not collapse, nothing so dramatic, nothing that would draw headlines. Just small, strange movements. Days where prices fell without obvious reason and then, just as mysteriously, recovered. Days where the volume of trading seemed to tell a different story than the headline numbers. A handful of economists, the ones not employed by banks or brokerage houses, had begun writing cautiously about valuation, about earnings ratios, about the mathematical impossibility of the trajectories being plotted on the market's charts. Most of their warnings were dismissed. Some were ridiculed. Roger Babson, a statistician who had been predicting a market crash for several years, gave a speech on September 5 warning that a crash is coming, and it may be terrific. The market dipped slightly that day. Traders called it the Babson break and laughed about it. Most of them bought more shares the following week. What no one outside the very top tier of finance understood was that the system was already under enormous internal pressure. The call money rate, the interest rate on the loans that brokers extended to their clients for margin purchases, had been rising all year. Banks were growing nervous. Some of the largest investment trusts had begun quietly reducing their exposure. The insiders, the men who actually understood how the machine worked, were, in many cases, already getting out. The ordinary investor didn't know this. The ordinary investor was still buying. Consider for a moment what it meant to be an ordinary investor in the fall of 1929. You might be a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania who had been putting $20 a month into the market for 3 years. You had done what the newspapers told you to do. You had done what your neighbor, who had made a small fortune, had suggested. Your account balance had grown, slowly at first and then faster, and you had begun to think, just to think, that maybe you were finally going to be free of the slow grind of financial anxiety that had characterized your entire adult life. You hadn't told your husband how much you'd borrowed from your broker. It was a small amount. The market always went up. Or perhaps you were a young man in Chicago who had come from nothing. Your father was a steelworker, your mother took in laundry, and you had found a job in a brokerage house as a runner, and you had watched, day after day, men making fortunes in the time it took to process an order form. You had started investing what little you could spare. You had borrowed a bit more. You had told yourself that this was how the system worked now. This was the new America. This was your chance. Or perhaps you were Harold Simmons, the broker who stepped from that cab on Broad Street on the morning of October 24th with new shoes and an expensive watch, who had been in this business for 15 years and had never seen anything like the last 5, who had made money and made money and made more money and had begun, somewhere in the back of his mind, to believe that he had simply figured something out that others hadn't, that the market rewarded the intelligent and the bold, and that he was both. By the time Harold walked through the doors of the exchange that morning, the world he believed in had approximately 4 hours left to exist. October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday. The opening bell rang at 10 o'clock and within minutes, the floor of the New York Stock Exchange descended into something that had no precedent in living memory. Sell orders. Cascading, overwhelming, relentless sell orders. They had begun flowing into the exchange before the bell even rang, from investors who had been watching the pre-market indicators with growing dread, from brokers who had received margin calls the night before and were liquidating positions to cover loans, from a handful of large institutional sellers who had made the decision, quietly, without announcement, to reduce their exposure. The moment the market opened, those sell orders hit the floor with a force that the system was not built to absorb. Within the first hour, prices began to move in a direction that seemed almost physically impossible to the men watching the boards. Not drifting downward, falling. Stocks that had been trading at highs for months were dropping 5 points, 10 points, 15 points in the time it took to process a single transaction. The ticker tape, that crucial mechanism by which prices were communicated to the thousands of investors across the country who were watching in brokerage offices and hotel lobbies and even from home, began to fall behind. This was, in ways that are difficult to overstate, catastrophic. When the ticker falls behind, investors don't know what anything is actually worth. They see prices that are already outdated, sometimes by an hour, sometimes by more, and they must make decisions based on information that is already ancient history. Some of them, seeing the tape running behind and sensing that something was badly wrong, called their brokers in a panic. Others, unable to reach their brokers because the telephone lines were completely overwhelmed, simply waited and watched the tape print numbers that grew more disturbing by the minute. By noon, the situation had become so extreme that Richard Whitney, vice president of the exchange, a figure of almost theatrical authority, walked onto the floor and, in front of hundreds of traders, placed a bid for 10,000 shares of U.S. Steel at $205 per share. It was above the market price. It was a deliberate, visible signal. The big money was not panicking. The big money was buying. The market is fine. It was theater. Expensive, high-stakes theater. Whitney's bid, which had been arranged in a frantic meeting of the heads of the largest banks in J.P. Morgan's private library, temporarily stemmed the bleeding. The market rallied in the afternoon. The newspapers, hungry for a narrative of resilience, seized on it. By the time the closing bell rang, prices had recovered some of their losses, and the men who ran the banks and the brokerage houses allowed themselves a cautious exhale. The worst, perhaps, was over. It was not over. It had not even properly begun. The weekend that followed Black Thursday was, in the upper echelons of American finance, a period of almost manic activity. Bankers met. Brokers telephoned each other across time zones. Treasury officials conferred. The exchange issued statements designed to project calm. The newspapers, largely, cooperated, printing reassurances alongside the damage reports, framing Thursday's events as a correction rather than a catastrophe. President Herbert Hoover, his administration still only 7 months old, said that the fundamental business of the country was on a sound and prosperous basis. John D. Rockefeller, 89 years old, the very emblem of American financial permanence, issued a statement saying that he and his son were buying stocks. The message was clear. The smart money is not afraid. You shouldn't be either. Across the country, in the apartments and houses and rented rooms where ordinary investors lived, the weekend passed in a state of suspended dread. People read the papers. They called their brokers and were told everything was fine. Some of them, acting on instinct, decided to sell, to get out while they still could. Others decided to hold. Some, remarkably, decided to buy more, trusting the reassurances, believing that the panic had been temporary and that the market was about to recover. By the time Monday morning arrived, the decision had been made for many of them. The margin calls had gone out. A margin call is the mechanism by which a broker demands that an investor put up additional collateral, additional cash, to cover a loan that is now insufficiently secured because the value of the stocks used as collateral has dropped. In a stable market, margin calls are rare. In a falling market, they become self-reinforcing. The broker demands more cash, the investor doesn't have it. The broker is forced to sell the investor's stocks to cover the loan, which drives prices lower, which triggers more margin calls, which forces more selling, which drives prices lower still. This is the mechanism that transforms a correction into a catastrophe. And it was already in motion. Monday, October 28th. Black Monday. The market opened and did not waver in its direction for a single moment. There was no ambiguity this time. No flicker of hope or recovery. The sell orders came in waves, enormous, cascading waves, and there was no Richard Whitney waiting in the wings with a theatrical bid, no consortium of bankers with enough money and enough nerve to stand against what was coming. The market fell. 13% in a single day. 13%. Numbers that had represented real lives, savings accounts, retirement plans, college funds, second mortgages taken out to fund investments, loans from neighbors and family members, evaporating in hours. Outside the exchange, crowds gathered. Not just curious bystanders now, but people with genuine stakes, clerks who had their savings invested, small business owners who had borrowed to buy stocks, anyone who understood enough to know that something terrible was happening and not enough to know exactly how terrible. Police were deployed to keep order. Rumors moved through the crowd faster than facts. Someone had jumped from a window, someone had shot themselves, a bank had closed, the exchange was going to shut down. Some of the rumors were true. Some were not. It was increasingly difficult to tell the difference. And then, something even worse happened. October 29th, 1929. Black Tuesday. The day the machine broke. If Black Monday had been a catastrophe, Black Tuesday was something beyond categorization, a total, system-wide failure of the kind that the architects of the modern financial system had genuinely believed could not happen. The sell orders that poured into the exchange in the opening minutes of trading were not the hesitant, fearful liquidations of individual investors making difficult decisions. They were panicked, indiscriminate, overwhelming. Investors didn't care what price they got. They needed out. They needed cash. They needed the stocks, whatever they were worth, converted into something real. 16 million shares changed hands that day. 16 million. The previous record, set just days before, had been 12 million. The ticker tape, already incapable of keeping up, fell hours behind reality. In brokerage offices across the country, investors were watching prices that were not just outdated but meaningless. By the time a price printed on the tape, it bore no relationship to what the stock was actually selling for on the floor. The phones did not stop ringing. They rang in brokerage offices and bank lobbies and private homes and hotel rooms. They rang in the offices of companies whose stocks were being destroyed, executives watching their personal net worth collapse in real time. They rang in the homes of ordinary investors who could not get through to their brokers and sat listening to the ring. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings, with a growing terror that the person on the other end had simply stopped answering because there was nothing left to say. By the time the closing bell rang on October 29th, the market had lost another 12%. In 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, the Dow had fallen 25%. The combined losses were in the tens of billions of dollars, a figure so large that it existed beyond ordinary comprehension, a number that required an entirely new framework to understand because no framework yet existed for losses of this magnitude. Harold Simmons, the broker who had stepped from his cab 3 days earlier with new shoes and an expensive watch, sat at his desk at 4:30 in the afternoon of October 29th and looked at his account statements and understood that he was ruined. Not poor. Not reduced. Ruined. The word had a particular resonance. Not just the loss of money but the loss of a self-conception that had been built over 15 years. The loss of the story he had been telling himself about who he was and what he had achieved and what the future held. He sat there for a long time. No one in the building asked if he was all right. Everyone was sitting in the same way. In the days and weeks that followed Black Tuesday, a strange and terrible quiet settled over Wall Street. Not peace, nothing like peace, but the specific silence that descends after a catastrophic event when the immediate chaos has subsided and what remains is simply the wreckage. The market continued to fall. This is the part of the story that is often misunderstood. The crash of 1929 is not simply a single week's events, the 3 black days of Thursday, Monday, and Tuesday. Those days were the dramatic apex, the moment of public rupture. But the actual destruction of wealth continued for years. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had peaked at 381 in September 1929, would continue to fall, with occasional, devastating rallies that gave false hope, until it reached 41 in July 1932. 41. An 89% decline from its peak. The longest, deepest bear market in American history. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The numbers are abstract in the way that true catastrophe is always abstract when reduced to figures. What the numbers obscure is what happened to actual human beings, to the millions of ordinary Americans whose relationship with money, with institutions, with the future itself, was permanently altered by what occurred in that final week of October 1929. Consider the banks. Throughout 1930 and 1931 and 1932, banks across the United States began to fail. Not the great Wall Street institutions, those had other mechanisms of survival, but the small banks, the community banks, the savings banks in small towns and mid-sized cities where farmers had deposited their harvests and shopkeepers had put away their margins and families had stored whatever they had managed to save. When the value of the securities these banks held collapsed, and when the loans they had extended to investors for margin purchases went bad, the banks simply ran out of money. And when word spread that a bank was in trouble, which it always did, at the speed of rumor, depositors ran to withdraw their savings, which accelerated the collapse, which prompted more bank runs. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 American banks failed. 9,000. each one representing the savings of hundreds or thousands of ordinary people who had done nothing wrong, who had not speculated, had not borrowed recklessly, had simply saved their money in the place where money was supposed to be safe. Their money was gone. Not reduced. Not devalued. Gone. The accounts had closed. The money no longer existed in any form they could access. There was no federal deposit insurance. That would not be created until 1933, in the direct aftermath of this disaster. There was no safety net of any kind for ordinary depositors whose bank had failed. If your savings were in a failed bank, your savings were simply gone, and there was nothing you could do about it. The unemployment rate, which had been around 3% in 1929, climbed to 8% by 1930, to 15% by 1931, to over 23% by 1932. 1 in 4 American workers had no job. In some cities and regions the numbers were far higher. Construction had virtually stopped. Manufacturing had contracted by almost half. International trade had collapsed, accelerated by the catastrophically misjudged Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, which raised import taxes so high that other countries retaliated in kind, strangling the global trading system that American companies depended on. The Depression, for that is what it had become, the Great Depression, was not merely an economic event. It was a psychological one, a civilizational one. The people who lived through those years carried something with them for the rest of their lives that those who came after would struggle to fully understand. It was not simply the experience of poverty, though many of them experienced poverty in forms that were genuinely desperate. It was the experience of having believed, completely and with every reason to believe, in a system that had then destroyed them. It was the loss not just of money but of trust. Trust in banks. Trust in markets. Trust in the institutions that had told them, repeatedly and authoritatively, that everything was fine. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith, who would spend much of his career studying what happened in 1929, wrote that the crash revealed the extent to which the prosperity of the 1920s had depended on mass psychology rather than mass production. The economy had not simply contracted. It had been exposed. The machinery had been pulled back to reveal the mechanism, and the mechanism, it turned out, was largely belief. When the belief collapsed, the economy collapsed with it. The psychological shift that ordinary Americans underwent during this period was gradual, layered, and devastating. First there was denial. The market will recover. The experts say so. The president says so. The bankers say so. Then there was bargaining. It will come back. I just have to hold on. I just have to wait. Then, slowly, like a tide going out, came the realization. It was not coming back. Not soon. Not for them. The schoolteacher in Pennsylvania who had been putting $20 a month into the market stopped. Not because she couldn't afford it. She couldn't. She'd lost everything. But because the act itself now seemed almost delusional, like planting crops in concrete. The young man in Chicago who had dreamed of escaping his father's life found that the escape route had simply closed. He went back to the steel plant. If there was work at the steel plant, there often wasn't. And Harold Simmons, the broker with the new shoes, left the industry altogether. He moved to New Jersey, found work in insurance, a different kind of promise, a more modest one, and never spoke about the market again. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone who asked. Some losses, it turns out, are not just financial. Some losses rewrite the story a person tells about themselves so completely that there is simply nothing left to say. In the years following the crash, the United States government launched a series of investigations designed to understand, and to assign responsibility for, what had happened. The Pecora Commission hearings of 1932 and 1933, led by Ferdinand Pecora, a former assistant district attorney from New York, produced testimony that shocked even the most financially sophisticated observers. What emerged from those hearings was a portrait of a system in which the very institutions entrusted with managing other people's money had, in many cases, been systematically exploiting their position for personal gain. Banks had been underwriting securities they knew to be of dubious value and selling them to clients. Brokers had been manipulating stock prices through coordinated buying and selling, a practice called pool operations, that created artificial momentum and then allowed the operators to sell at the top while ordinary investors held the bag. Executives had been using their company's money for personal loans and then structuring the accounting so that it looked legitimate. None of it was technically illegal. That was perhaps the most disturbing revelation of all. Not that bad actors had broken the rules, but that the rules had been designed in a way that made the exploitation almost entirely permissible. The financial system of the 1920s had operated in a regulatory environment so permissive that the distance between innovation and fraud was, in many cases, essentially non-existent. The response, when it finally came, was sweeping. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 created the Securities and Exchange Commission and established, for the first time, a comprehensive federal framework for regulating the stock market. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 separated commercial banking from investment banking, attempting to prevent banks from using depositors' savings to fund speculative activities. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, was created, guaranteeing depositors savings up to a certain limit, eliminating the kind of bank runs that had destroyed so many ordinary lives. These were real reforms. They mattered. They changed the landscape of American finance for generations. But no legislation could undo what had already been done. No regulatory framework could restore the savings that had vanished or the jobs that had disappeared or the belief that had been broken. The reforms could build guardrails. They could not rebuild what had been destroyed. And they could not prevent the fundamental human susceptibility, the tendency, when markets are rising and confidence is high and everyone around you seems to be getting rich, to believe that this time is different. That the lessons of history don't apply. That the machine will keep running because it has always kept running, because it seems impossible that it could stop. There is a question that haunts any serious examination of 1929, a question that is discomforting precisely because it has no clean, satisfying answer. Could it have been stopped? The academic literature on the causes and prevention of the Great Depression fills entire libraries. Economists have argued for decades, are arguing still, about what could have been done differently, when and by whom. Some argue that the Federal Reserve, by raising interest rates in 1928 to try to cool speculative activity, contributed directly to the crash. Others argue that it moved too late and too timidly. Some argue that the wave of bank failures could have been prevented by more aggressive government intervention, others that the intervention that did happen made things worse. The arguments are sophisticated, evidence-based, and genuinely unresolved. But beneath all of them lies something simpler and harder to argue against. The crash happened because millions of people, individually rational, often quite intelligent, operating with the information available to them at the time, made decisions that were collectively catastrophic. They bought when they should have been cautious. They borrowed when they should have been conservative. They trusted when they should have questioned. They celebrated precisely at the moment when they should have been afraid. This is not a criticism. It is a description of how human beings behave inside systems built on confidence. Systems where the primary mechanism of value creation is the shared belief that value will continue to be created. In those systems, the rational response to rising prices is to buy more. The irrational response, the response that would, in retrospect, have saved you, is to sell. The tragedy of 1929 is not that greedy men destroyed an economy. There were greedy men, certainly, and they caused real harm, and some of them deserved the investigations and the regulations and the historical condemnation that eventually came for them. But the tragedy is larger than villainy. The tragedy is that the system itself, built over decades by people who believed in it, who refined it, who thought they understood it, contained within it a vulnerability so fundamental that no amount of confidence or sophistication or experience could protect against it. The vulnerability was this: the system worked only as long as everyone believed it would. And belief, as history has demonstrated with terrible consistency, is not a stable foundation for anything. There are photographs from the days after the crash. Ordinary photographs, newspaper photographs, the kind of image that would not have been considered remarkable in its moment, that carry within them, now, a weight that is almost unbearable to look at. A man in a good suit standing outside a closed bank, hands in his pockets, looking at nothing. A woman in a queue outside an employment office, dressed too nicely for the context, still wearing the clothes of the life she'd had a month ago. A child selling apples on a Manhattan street corner, a common sight in the early 1930s, as destitute men bought a box of apples on credit and sold them one by one on the sidewalk for a nickel apiece. These images do not announce their weight. They simply exist, ordinary moments in an ordinary country, ordinary faces wearing ordinary expressions, until you understand what they are documenting, at which point they become almost impossible to look away from. The world rebuilt. It took a long time. Longer than anyone predicted in 1929, longer even than the most pessimistic observers believed possible in 1931 or 1932. It required a war, among other things, the mobilization of industrial capacity for military production that finally, at terrible cost, ended the unemployment crisis that the Depression had created. The institutions that were built in the aftermath, the regulatory frameworks, the deposit insurance, the social safety nets, changed the relationship between ordinary citizens and the financial system in ways that have endured, in modified form, to the present. But something was lost that was never fully recovered. Not the money. Money can be made again, can be accumulated again, can be rebuilt through patience and time, and the slow compound growth that John J. Raskob had written about, correctly if catastrophically mistimed, in his Ladies' Home Journal article. Not even the prosperity. The American economy grew again, grew enormously, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average eventually left 1929's peak far behind. What was lost was a certain kind of innocence. An innocence about markets, about what they are, about what they can do, about the relationship between paper wealth and real wealth. An innocence about institutions, about whether the people running them could be trusted, about whether their interests aligned with the interests of ordinary depositors and investors. An innocence, most fundamentally, about the nature of prosperity itself, about whether the wealth that felt so solid, so permanent, so essentially deserved, was actually any of those things. The men and women who lived through 1929 and its aftermath carried that lost innocence with them for the rest of their lives. They became, many of them, constitutionally cautious about money, saving in cash rather than investing, distrusting financial advice, keeping emergency funds in places that felt more tangible than a brokerage account. They became, in the vocabulary of behavioral economists, depression-scarred, permanently altered by an experience that had rewritten their understanding of how the world worked at the most fundamental level. Their children and grandchildren did not have that experience. And so, with the natural tendency of human memory toward the benign, the lessons began to fade. The structures built after 1929 held for decades. Then they were modified. Then some were removed. The Glass-Steagall separation of commercial and investment banking, established in 1933 in direct response to the abuses the Pecora Commission had documented, was repealed in 1999. The argument made was that the financial world had changed, that the old constraints were no longer necessary, that the banks and the markets had grown sophisticated enough to police themselves. It was a familiar argument. It had a familiar ring. The story of 1929 is not, ultimately, a story about a specific week in a specific year when a specific set of economic conditions produced a specific catastrophe. It is a story about something more enduring, about the relationship between human psychology and financial systems, about the way that confidence can build structures of extraordinary fragility and call them permanence, about the terrifying speed at which a world that feels solid can reveal itself to be built on air. It is a story that ends and ends and ends again. The ticker tape keeps printing. The machine keeps running. And somewhere, in an office building in a city that believes completely in its own prosperity, A broker in new shoes is stepping from a cab and looking up at a building and feeling, in his bones, that today is going to be another fine day to be alive.